can still hear me okay this way?
Yep. And here we go. It's recording. Actually started again. Hey, Rory. So here we are. I'm so looking forward to talking to you because you embody so much of what is beautiful about Judaism, and wanted to get in touch with you, especially around some of the concepts that we're studying this year across the United Methodist Church through United Methodist Women. This concept of covenant. Could you help us understand some of what your community and your study has brought you to understand what covenant is, where it comes from?
Well, I'm really excited to get to chat with you also, and to do what I can to share some of this. I mean, obviously, I first feel the need to really start off and emphasize that within the Jewish community, there's a broad range of relationships to covenant, and that's actually probably one of the defining lines between movements within Judaism. Would be how we perceive the relationship that we have as human beings to God, and both the nature of God in that relationship, the nature of us in that relationship, and even just what it means to have a relationship. So we're already going to be talking about a very wide spectrum, and I want to start off maybe looking somewhat historically or traditionally at how the Jewish people have understood what it means to have a covenant. On the most basic level, we really see it as being in relationship, in having a relationship that involves a requirement from both parties. And so it means that there are things that are being asked of us as people in this world, and there's also things that are being asked of God in return, or maybe a better way to say it is being promised from both sides, that we make certain promises and commitments, and in exchange there's commitments and promises that we receive in return. And we understand that, I would say, similarly for between people as between people and God. But the crucial difference for covenant when we start talking about the religious concept of covenant is that we recognize that it's somewhat of an absurd statement to say that we can be in covenant with God, to the extent that there's no way that there could be equity in this covenant, right? There's no way that that we can give the same as what God can give, and there's no way that we can demand of God that which can be demanded of us. And so within this covenant, there's a certain sense of generosity, really, right? That the covenant itself is not actually this kind of business deal, because it's really an act of graciousness on the part of God to even engage with us in this exchange, because God doesn't need us to be a partner in the covenant, so to speak, right? And that which we can bring to the covenant is not in any way equal to that which God can bring to the covenant. So the covenant really, while we use this term in a sense that sounds more like this business deal, you know, it really is this act of kindness on behalf of God, right? It's actually a gift that God is giving to the people, but it's a gift that's not given without an ask. So it's not a complete, you know, just giving. There is something that's being asked in return. But really, you know, and so we kind of use this language, but the language itself already feels sort of clunky, because right? Like just for the, right, it's sort of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a better example, right? But if you had some kind of like billionaire who's offering to go into some business dealings with you when they could just buy you up or you know, knock you out of competition or whatever it is, right? There's a certain graciousness that comes with that.
Beautiful. Do you see the covenant, like how, when you look at the covenant as it was given to Adam and Eve, or the covenant that was given to Moses, or the covenant that was, you know, expressed throughout Scripture, are there differences between those covenants in your understanding? Or is it a gradual change? I mean, obviously historical context matters a lot at each point, right? Of the writers and of who's, of anyway, I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah, no, I think we do. The answer is yes. We do see a difference between those covenants. And there's different opinions as to where that difference is coming from, or how that difference is coming about. So part of it can be seen as historical context. You know, there's sort of this idea of, you know, God creates the world, and then the relationship with humanity starts to evolve as people are given autonomy. And what we then do with that is constantly changing. And so the relationship between us has to change. And so that's one way that we can look at it, right? That what God promises to Adam and Eve is going to be different than right, Noah after sin has really overtaken the world, right, and so on. But we also do see really a shift from, I shouldn't say a shift, but we see both the universal and the particular. And so for the Jewish community, we would very much understand both covenants. And that both covenants, one is not replacing any of the prior ones, but that the covenants that begin with Abraham and then with Moses are very much a particular covenant, whereas Adam and Eve and Noah are universal covenants. And so we see those as both being incredibly live, right? God has a covenant with all of humanity, and then there's also a unique role that the Jewish people have within the world. And that unique role doesn't replace the relationship that God has with any other community, but we very much see ourselves as having a, I'm trying to think of the correct word for it, you know, not quite having a job, having a responsibility in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that everyone doesn't have a responsibility. In a way, I don't know that we have different ways of looking at how that's related to one another. But I would say for myself personally and for some others, we almost don't busy ourselves with trying to figure out the difference between the particular and the universal, so much as knowing that it's really, you know, it's not sort of my concern to try to figure out your role, but it's really my concern to pay attention to my role, right? And that I need to really be focused on what is it that I have a responsibility for within this world.
So how
in that sense, right? It's both together.
How do you understand the particulars in today's world from the kind of understanding of this larger covenant? Like, how does that work its way into your life?
So it works its way into my life in a lot of ways. It works its way into my life in the everyday rituals, right? And so the food that I choose to eat, in keeping kashrut and keeping the laws of kosher food, the way that I keep the Sabbath, the holidays, right? All of those are going to somehow be reflective of this relationship and this covenant that I feel that I have. But I don't think that it's sufficient to say that the covenant only remains in the internal. right? To say that it's only about the holidays or the food, right? Those are things that I can do in isolation. And so I very much believe that all of those rituals and those requirements are meant to really push us to think about what that means in the broader world. And so that's really where I think we have a responsibility as Jews to be asking questions about things like Syrian refugees, climate change, hunger, poverty, right? That it's, and again, I want to really emphasize that I don't feel that we alone have a responsibility within that, but that we feel ourselves particularly called. And when I say particularly called, I don't mean exclusively called, and I don't even mean necessarily more especially called, but it's a language that was given for us. And I don't feel I'm doing a good job of trying to explain what I'm thinking through, right? That in a sense, right, you know, when you speak to me, I think you're speaking specifically to me. It's not that I think you don't ever talk to anybody else. It's not that I think what you're saying is only special for me, but we're having a one-on-one conversation right now, and so these words are for me. Right? And so I don't think that the rest of the world doesn't also have a responsibility to think about all of those things, but we very much see the Torah as speaking to us, and so that's a language that was given to us. Whether everybody else was given a language, that's going to be a whole debate, right? So whether I believe then that there are others who were meant to speak to other groups or other traditions are their version of the truth, or God gave the Torah and the rest of the world should then try to understand the Torah better and try to get it from us. We can have a whole other debate about our theological worldview. And all of those will exist within Judaism. But very much just seen as, right, that the covenant brings us to, for me, right, it's really just about my responsibility. I can't worry about your responsibility. I can implore you to also ask these questions. But ultimately, when I choose the food that I eat, or not driving on the Sabbath, or eating matzah on Passover and remembering the Exodus, it's because I need to ask myself what that means to me, that we were slaves, that we were set free, that freedom doesn't exist everywhere in the world, right? That's something that's a personal question for me.
I got it. Can I ask you questions about the covenant and land? And what the relationship is between kind of this abundance of creation and the covenant, and where you guys, where some thought is in that level.
It's a pretty vague question.
Sorry. So I guess really about covenant and land, and about there's both the specifics around you know, this understanding that a particular land is given to you, but there's also another particular around for me around the rest of creation and what's the covenant between. Remember I'm economic and environmental justice staff member, so I'm very interested in what's the theology around land in the covenant. I mean, it's always there. It's in each of those covenants. It's contextual, right? Like,
right. Well, and you know, I mean, I think the big crux of the covenant that starts with Abraham is the promise not only of land, but of becoming a people. And so what does it mean to become a people seems to be tied to land. And we can probably have a whole long discussion just the question of whether or not that's a historical reality or also a present reality. Right? Like you know, and I find it so fascinating because I have so we're talking specifically now about the modern land of Israel. And that's actually the example that's going to come into my mind, but maybe this exists in other contexts, I don't know. But I have friends who have moved to Israel and will immediately start to call themselves Israeli. And I find it so striking because that's not the way we talk in America, right? If you've been in America for 3 generations, you're still Italian American or German American or right, whatever it is, we tend to hyphenate, right? No matter, right? Or I'll still talk about, I mean, my grandparents were all born in America with the exception of one, but I'll still talk about my family being from Eastern Europe, even though I have no connection to Eastern Europe at all. And so it's something I just think about also in our modern context, right? What does it mean to be a people, and what does it mean to be a people without a land? Right, and this is, you know, unfortunately we've had a bad history with nationalism and some of what that's meant for our world. But I think that's just a very live question that we have to sit with, right? Where is our identity? And I think America has really forced people to question that in new ways because we live in a country where your religion doesn't have to be listed on your national ID card. You're not forced to, by and large, I mean, we still have a lot of issues, right? But you're not forced to live in certain areas based off of ethnicity, religion. So what does it mean now? And I'll say for Jews, this has been a huge struggle. Right? What does it mean to be Jewish for the first time in history where nobody forced you to be Jewish? Right? You didn't have to live in a ghetto, and you didn't have to. Right, you don't have to identify in any way as Jewish. And so suddenly we really struggle with, does it mean you belong to a synagogue? Does it mean that you identify as Jewish? I mean, we have this huge phenomenon of Jews who identify as Jewish and identify as secular Jews, right? Very much Judaism is part of their identity, but whether it's culturally or whether it's playing out in the way that they give money or they volunteer at organizations, right, might never play out in a religious context at all. Or we can sort of question whether that should be counted as religious. So I don't know how to really contextualize it in the modern times, and I think that's also kind of the debate we'll see. Right? I think some will say for the context of the time that it was in, right, the promise of being a people was, or becoming a nation, was a promise of growing as a people and then having a land, right? And that's what made them a people. Judaism is sort of gone through these really fascinating iterations where it developed as a people outside of a land with the goal of entering a land, entered the land of Israel, developed this Israelite kingdom and the kingdom of Judah, right, had their land, and then was exiled from their land. And then had to really struggle to recreate a Judaism that was separate from that land. And we can, again, have a whole other long conversation about, I mean, it's one of my favorite topics of how the rabbis of post-Second Temple period really kept Judaism alive when it should have died out, given that so many of our rituals were about the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. And what did it mean to now not have a temple and not have Jerusalem? And we really translated that into synagogues and primarily really into houses of study. Study replaced ritual. And so now rabbis replaced priests. And it's just a fascinating way that that happened. And so within that, when we started talking about Israel within the prayers, Israel started to take on this new context of meaning some sort of kind of lofty goal, and not necessarily a literal land. Right? I would say not necessarily. I think it's sort of hard. I don't know that anyone was ever forced to really define what they meant when they talked about Israel. But when we talk about Israel, we sort of talk about like this restoration of the temple. We're talking about the restoration of this kingdom, of, you know, this peoplehood that we had had. And for the most part, most Jews, I will argue, never believed that they would ever see that as a reality, right? That came to mean the Messianic era. And so when it started to become a possibility in the land of Israel, 1947 and 1948, a lot of Jews really struggled with what that meant. Many Jews did not go back in 1948. Many felt that it was the wrong thing to do, that only God could bring people back. And it was really only after 1967, after the Six-Day War, that something really shifted, that people started to feel like something miraculous had happened, right? They started to feel like they were seeing the hand of God in that. Mm. And that's when you start to see really a shift into what we call kind of religious Zionism, right? Because before that, Jews would go to Palestine because of the history, because of the connection to land, or because they thought maybe that they should be there, or because they didn't have anywhere else to go. And you had other Zionists, Theodor Herzl and others, who felt that Jews needed to have their own country, just like every other people had their own country. But you don't really have the rise of religious Zionism until later, the rise that God says we can be in this land.
Is it part of the covenant? Is that their understanding?
Yeah, and that does. It goes back to the covenant, right? That because really before that, it's the idea that God gave us this land and then God kicked us out of the land.
Yeah.
Right? But it was always meant to be our land. But right, if you go through the prophets, right, in Isaiah and Jeremiah, right, like we sort of lose the land, but not permanently.
Right.
Right? Not permanently, but we don't get to live in the land. And now we're really seeing kind of this budding up of this religious worldview with this political movement.
Yeah.
Right? And where you know, like I said, most Jews weren't looking to go there because they thought, you know, you wait for the Messiah to come and God brings you back and the temple is rebuilt, right? It's everything our prayers talked about in this sort of view of this ideal, futuristic Eden perception.
Yeah.
And then you suddenly have, all of a sudden there's United Nations that says, sure, there could be a country called Israel. And now it's confusing for people. I mean, really, right? It's government with elections.
Is it a miracle or is it a political hoorah? Like, who knows?
And a lot of Jews are really struggling with what that means. And so you've got people who feel like, no, God gave us this land. And by the way, God gave us more land than is the land of Israel today. And so that's causing some conflict, because if you believe that this is my God-given land, then I'm gonna try to take some of that land back. You know, you've got people who feel that, you know, here we've got this chance to have this country and get this land back, but it's all caught up with politicians who get arrested and you know, I mean, sort of modern day problems. And so, you know, there's still the belief that there is a covenant that's tied to the land, but I think that perception has sort of shifted to the question of, do we mean this literal land today, or do we mean sort of just this perception, right? The same way, like, I don't know how it is in Christian circles, but in within Jewish scholarship, like there's sort of this debate of like, where was the Garden of Eden, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know, but like I never kind of imagined. I remember somebody was saying like, oh, it would have been somewhere near Iraq or something like that. But you know, I never sort of imagined it as a literal place on earth. You know, like for me, right, it sort of became this almost heavenly concept, and you know, and sort of once we get kicked out, then right. I don't sort of imagine there's kind of this, I don't know, you know, farm somewhere with these angels walking it with their fiery swords, you know, and I guess like Israel in some ways I've taken on maybe a similar imagery for some people, right? Do we mean these borders, or does it mean some sort of kind of heavenly perfection, you know, that comes with some sort of world to come that we don't really know how to understand?
Mm-hmm. Is it some way is it tied to your comment at the beginning about the special responsibility that the people of the covenant have is it related, is it related to that side of the covenant equation?
So I would say yes. I would say it absolutely is. But there's another challenge to the covenant equation, which is that historically for the Jewish community, the covenant has also come to mean a covenant of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow what it meant to be chosen as a Jewish people meant to be persecuted throughout history. And so now those two things again come to a head when you start talking about the land of Israel, because you're talking about trying to reconcile both what is my special role that I'm given with this land, and what's my responsibility to protect myself when historically I've seen every culture persecute or try to exterminate the Jewish people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you one more question. So the words hesed, is that how you say it?
That's
Hesed and berith? Do you have a way of thinking about those words? I mean, I'm sure you do. But how do you, when you hear those words, what happens?
So brit would be the word that we typically use when we're talking about covenant. And that's the word that often gets used within the Torah. We talk about Abraham famously has the brit bein hapatarim, the covenant between the parts, right? And that's we sort of understand as some of that kind of business deal that I was talking about. We still use that term today. We talk about a brit milah. We talk about the ritual of circumcision that's done typically on the 8th day when a baby boy is born. We still call that a brit. We talk about people entering into the covenant. So that's usually the word that we'll use. I think it's really interesting that you bring up the word chesed, because chesed we would not typically use in relationship to covenant. Chesed we really understand as meaning kindness. But it's interesting because I started off by talking about the covenant as a form of kindness.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to me, but I've never thought of it that way, right? I would never call the brit, the covenant, a chesed, but when you planted the word in me, I would say, yeah, if you said to me, well, is this a kindness of God? That's how I would call it. I would say that it's God's chesed, right? It's God's kindness. But we talk about chesed, we talk about it as doing good deeds. Milut chasadim is, or could be acts of charity, giving somebody food. And all of that would be within this idea of chesed.
Mm-hmm.
So chesed, though, is not necessarily that bi-directional relationship that we talk about with brit, right? Chesed is really unidirectional, right? I do a good deed for somebody else. No, I don't mean, obviously there's something I get out of doing that good deed, and no arrow is ever only so straightforward. But, by and large, it's really very, right, I'm giving something to you, and I'm not expecting anything in return.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. It's lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lori, you're amazing.
Yeah, it's cool.
So articulate.
It's very helpful. Yeah.
God, you make me cry.
So around the part of the covenant that is the commandments and the laws, how does that fit into the idea of the covenant and the sort of the responsibilities of the covenant people, or the rules that they're supposed to live by as a part of the covenant, or is that how it's understood?
So it's sort of this interesting. I mean, I feel like if God had a lawyer, they'd say never sign this deal, right? Because basically, it seems like God is saying, I'm going to give you all of these things, and in exchange, I want you to walk in my path. And I'm going to give
Mm-hmm.
you these guidelines of what that means. Right? But a very crucial part for the Jewish faith is that when we don't follow that path, God is able to rescind some of the gifts but never break the covenant.
Hmm.
Right? So we get kicked out of the land of Israel, but we never lose the covenant with God.
Beautiful.
And so in a sense, though, following the path we can see as two ways. One is to try to rebuild some of what we've lost in the covenant, right? If we follow the laws and do everything as God commanded us, then potentially we can get this return to the coming of the Messiah, which is maybe a return to sort of this perfect life in the Garden of Eden type of, right? So this elimination of suffering and right, that maybe our time in the world is all to try to get back to what could really be this perfect world. And again, right, that's where Israel starts to come to reflect that. Or maybe part of keeping the covenant is because God has given a gift in telling us the things we should do in order to just live a good life, right? And maybe the reward is the path in and of itself, right? To be more godly. And we'll see both of those really reflected in Jewish thought.
I think one of the things that you told me once that I completely revolutionized my thought around the Pharisees, if you remember that conversation around Holy Week. We were having an interreligious conversation around Holy Week. And so I talked about the Pharisees the way I've always heard about the Pharisees and thought about the Pharisees. And Rory looked up and she said, I'm a Pharisee. And I just went, and then she said, for me, the law is love. It is love. It is love towards God, love towards others. It is, and that was an extraordinary moment for me. Because I felt that when I was also with you, Rory, whenever I'm with you, whenever I see you practicing that Shabbat ritual, which isn't very often, but that one time I got to see that incredible moment where the siren went off in Brooklyn, the lights went off, the candle was lit, and we stopped. And this beautiful hush of being erupted. So quite something.
We get the chance to do it again.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So Elmira, is there anything else? I know you probably want to talk forever, but we've kept her for.
Yeah. Oh yeah, because I got to go. It's just about the word Canaan.
The place Canaan.
Yeah, the place Canaan, the word Canaan.
What is it?
So a related thing is that there's another place where Brueggemann talks about being a blessing and receiving a blessing. So part of what he's saying is that the covenant community is not only receives a blessing, but its job is to be a blessing. So and somehow the word Canaan as the embodiment of something that's not about exploitation is mixed up in that sort of, that's part of the thing about being turning over unjust systems or being a model that's not about injustice.
I think it's a beautiful interpretation. It's not one I've ever heard before. Typically, we talk about Canaan as a literal place, as the precursor to what becomes the British Mandate of Palestine and what becomes then the precursor to the land of Israel. So, it's interesting to sort of understand, though, because we do we do understand the people, the Canaanites, as not being a righteous people, which perhaps also helps in terms of what does it mean that we see the commandment to drive them out, which really does not jive well with our modern emotions and sensibilities. And so that becomes one way for us to kind of justify what has transpired. And you know, I think it becomes a beautiful way of also universalizing some of the message, right? And so it's not just about conquering this one land, but about combating exploitation in all lands. And that's a really, I'm going to have to think on that one more, because I don't think that goes against Jewish thought, but traditionally it's not how we have understood it. We have really understood it in a very literal sense.
Okay. Yeah.
We got to have a book study on this book. I'm totally blown away. I'm reading Sabbath and Resistance, which is also by this guy Bergerman. And I'm completely being revolutionized by it. It's just beautiful because it basically says that the whole eruption of the Sabbath happened within a context of people who knew slavery. So when you know slavery and you're incredibly, you know, every single waking moment is in a position of oppression and you're given freedom. And now God says, oh, and by the way, you get Sabbath.
Your voice is going in and out, Kathleen.
We're commanding you to take a Sabbath, and not only a Sabbath, but to release not only you, but your family and your slaves and your animals, and everybody is going to have a Sabbath. That's an extraordinary egalitarian society in a wild way. Like it's just a new economy, and that's what Bergerman is working with, which I'm blown away by the book. I love it.
Yeah.
And then go ahead. Sorry,
I was going to say I would completely agree with everything that you're saying, and that's very much how Judaism would also see the concept of Sabbath. We don't necessarily see that as tied to the concept of Canaan, which is what's really fascinating that you bring in.
Yeah. I see. Interesting.
Really interesting.
Yeah. This is really so helpful, just kind of to learn things and to understand and to have new things to think about it and new language, because your language is so beautiful. I mean, I think it will be a really important contribution to the work of this particular study, which is in the study, if I didn't say, it's a spiritual growth study. So the idea is to see whether people can really take seriously and grow spiritually, what is the impact of understanding these things from the sacred texts. Not necessarily to do the political work, but to take it seriously from a spiritual point of view and let that inform then where that takes you. What you said about a particular concept then making you think about what is happening in the moment, in this current moment, and how is it important there. Yeah, so you know, this is really just very helpful in terms of thinking about all those things. Yeah, I'm so grateful.
Rory. All right.
All right, so we'll when you're gonna, Kathleen, you're gonna have it transcribed, right?
Yeah, something like that. I'll probably do it, so it'll take a little while.
Yeah, and then we'll figure out the powers that be will sort of help us figure out what to do next and where it fits in. But clearly, I know in terms of my own work, this is incredibly helpful for the things that I'm trying to help small groups interpret some of these ideas about covenant, and to this has just really been very helpful. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm happy to help, and this has been fun. It's always a pleasure to get to see Kath, and we should do this every week. This is great.
I know. I got the treat of every week with Rory for a little while.
Oh, wow. Oh, cool.
at that little, what was that place called? Cafe Viva?
Yeah. Yeah.
A vegan pizza place. Yeah, I love that place. I think Elmira, my funnest moment with Rory was when she brought me into this her Maharat school, where they were talking. They had a male teacher because that's what they had at that point, and they were talking about all the cleanliness ritual for women around their menses. And there were two people in the class, one Polish and one Israeli, who spoke only in Hebrew. And I think that was who it was. And it was hilarious because I knew exactly what they were saying. So, it's pretty funny to have a male teacher about that, right?
Yeah.
Amazing. Anyway. All right, y'all. Have a good
That's great.
one.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Gotta go. Bye.
Bye.